This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show, as together we hear how they are making their world better. Welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Always good to have you here. So I've had lots of conversations recently about recruitment and retention. Those are huge issues right now facing us in the nonprofit sector. Now, I do think it's facing all the different sectors, not just the nonprofit sector, but since this is a nonprofit leadership podcast, we're going to talk about primarily the nonprofit sector. And today we're going to look at it from a little bit different angle. But I've been a big believer, you've heard me say this over and over again, that recruitment and retention are really hooked together. They're really two sides of the same coin in my mind. And we're having a difficult time keeping our people at nonprofits. Retention is becoming increasingly more difficult. I don't think it's just a post-COVID thing. I think it's something bigger than that. And my guest will say this, with this: compensation equals salary plus meaning. And I think he's right on this. And I think no matter what kind of cut you may have taken if you came to the nonprofit sector, getting paid more from whatever job you had, or you're coming into the nonprofit sector and you realize you could get paid better and higher at a different job that's in the for-profit sector, if you don't have the right quotient, if you will, of meaning, it's really difficult to recruit people and retain people. And that is one of the things that's showing up in the data. It's not the only thing, right? But it's one of the issues, is really having that proper balance. And I think this perspective, if you will, this equation of bringing together your salary and meaning together, that's what the compensation package really looks like for a nonprofit organization. So we're going to talk about leadership, how to grow as a leader, what they provide leaders in terms of helping them become stronger leaders, better focused on strategy, developing a more clear strategy. So a lot of interesting conversation topics that we have. And again, my guest is Doug Paul from We Are Catapult. And it's an organization that really comes alongside leaders and organizations in order to help them grow, scale, and become more healthy. So as always, thanks for tuning in. Now on to the show. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I have Doug Paul on the show from Catapult. Doug, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. You do a lot of things at Catapult to both help organizations and leaders. So let's just talk about that. What are some of the great things you're doing to help organizations grow and scale? And how can perhaps traditional strategies become a hindrance to growth and success as organizations evolve?
I mean, we do strategic planning, leadership intensives, refreshing a nonprofit's model, and some culture building, some other things. I mean, I feel like 85% of strategic outsiders are doing like fundraising development and training, stuff like that. And that's just not where we wanted to major. But we're really interested in the idea of like, there are these traditional strategies and playbooks that nonprofits use, but the world is wildly different than some of those playbooks and when they were written specifically. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is culture is accelerating, like, and reinventing itself now at a rate of every 18 months. And it used to be every 18 years. So so what we're doing is we're taking like a generation of change and compressing all of those changes in 18 months.
That's amazing. That's incredible.
It's wild. So my wife's a sociologist. And so like, this is just dinner table conversation. I
love it. I love to be at those dinner conversations. They're pretty meaty.
Yeah. So I think sometimes we get stuck and we don't know why. And I think just at a first glance, one of the reasons is like things change so fast.
Right.
It feels like we're never going to be able to keep up.
Yeah.
And so what do we do when we kind of like admit defeat and like, because no one can keep up with those kinds of changes. That's not possible. So if that's true, what do we do?
Yeah.
And so in many ways, that's where the crux of our work with Catapult comes in.
That's a good, no, I like that backdrop. And it is incredible to think how things are so quickly changing. It's interesting, isn't it? I've had so many conversations on the show with nonprofit organizations, particularly during COVID, I feel like COVID really pushed everybody to the same level of we need to adapt and be flexible and be nimble, or we're not going to survive essentially. And I think now with all what you're just sharing, everyone needs to stay at that same level too and realize things are changing so quickly around us. You can have to continue to be flexible and nimble. So now let's talk a little bit more about what you provide. I realize you specialize in helping organizations thrive, right? As an outside consultant. And I'm a big believer that there are times when a nonprofit needs an outside consultant. As you know, I'm a consultant and coach. And so a strategic outsider can really help guide the planning process for a nonprofit organization, particularly with some challenges maybe they just get stuck on or they are currently stuck on, helping them work through that, come up with new strategies. Why is it, in your opinion, from your experience, and of course, I know you're speaking as a consultant, but why is it important to have a strategic outsider that can really provide maybe a new and fresh perspective and be really beneficial to a nonprofit organization?
Sounds like you're asking me to sell why my job should exist.
I'm here. Prove yourself. Why do you need this?
Again, I don't think nonprofits need a consultant all the time,
Sure,
but I do
sure.
think there are like pivotal moments in the life cycle of an organization that are inflection points.
Yeah.
And those can be like positive inflection points or they can be negative inflection points. And sometimes we actually don't know which way it's going to go.
Yeah.
So like just a classic example in this sector is there's a founder and they're retiring.
Yeah.
Or they're moving on, they're doing something different. But they have the story, they're the lifeblood. And it's a really dangerous time for a nonprofit, but it's also like loaded with opportunity.
Yep.
So it could be a positive inflection point or a degrading inflection point. So I think in many ways, the reason you bring in a strategic outsider at those moments is our expertise is not in leading day-to-day leadership of a nonprofit. That's what the executive directors, CEOs, like, that's where their 10,000 hours are.
Right.
Our 10,000 hours are around those inflection point moments. And when you know it's either like massive opportunity or massive danger, you want to give yourself every chance to get the win.
Yeah.
And it's like the ability to position yourself to get that win is really important.
I like how you said that inflection points are so important. You're absolutely right, and critical. And a lot of nonprofits don't pivot well around inflection points. So let's talk about another thing, past experiences. I think as a nonprofit leader, certainly having past experience is absolutely critical. I mean, I think that's very important. You want to build off your past experience. However, sometimes there is a limitation when you only rely on your past experience. So how can nonprofits, from what you've experienced, speaking of experience, how can nonprofits overcome the limitations of relying only on their past experience and expertise in order to really navigate future challenges? We already talked about how technology is changing, our culture is changing, information and the amount of information we get is rapidly changing. So all these things are coming at us very quickly. How can we make sure we're able to navigate these future challenges?
Yeah. There's the cultural component of this and how things are accelerating and changing. But then there's also just like human behavior and what humans are like. And there's this phenomenon that you're probably familiar with that's called the curse of knowledge. And it's this idea, like there's this cruel irony that the more successful you are at doing something, the harder it is to see other ways of doing it. And
Good
so
point.
like Adam Grant, he writes about this a little bit in his book Original. So I don't want to pretend like I came up with this, but he talks about like we become prisoners of our prototypes. And the more successful you are, the harder it is to see different ways of doing it. Generally speaking, I think there are two ways that we can navigate this. One, and this will sound completely self-serving, is bring in someone from the outside who actually doesn't see things the way that you see things. And that actually is the gift that they're bringing. They bring what are called fresh eyes.
Yeah.
The second thing, and I think this has just got to become more normalized in our nonprofit sector, is we need to make innovation a core tenet of our culture.
Okay.
And like what we need to do is to like help nonprofits really think through like how do we create little pockets of R&D and see that as some of like the most important part of our mission as the leader of a nonprofit is to at least have 5 to 10% of our effort around thinking through the future and around the next couple of corners. Like that has to become, I really think this is like one of my soapbox issues. I think this is one of like this idea around innovation and adaptability with leadership.
Yeah.
This is one of the core leadership skills of the future.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like it. Well, and that leads us well into strategy. How to develop an actionable strategy plan. Like that's really important for a nonprofit leader, organization. So how does what you provide help align an organization's vision on the one hand with its day-to-day operations? What have you found to be really effective on the strategy front?
Yeah. Well, this is one where like I can just,
This could be a long answer. Yeah. 10
and I
minutes.
might be the only one who enjoys the rabbit hole. So 93.1% of nonprofit employees don't understand how their everyday work connects to the strategy.
Interesting. Wow.
Maybe a little while later, we'll talk about like why that is so undermining
Yeah.
in the nonprofit sector specifically. But here's the like one of the big statements I would make. Most organizations don't have a strategy at all.
Yeah.
So they have things that they're doing and they
Right.
have a mission, but they have no, like a strategy is a hypothesis. If I do blank, then blank will happen.
Right.
And that means by definition, it could be wrong.
Yes.
And so, if there's any book like I could pitch to your listeners to read, there's this book by this guy named Richard Rummelt called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy.
Okay. One more time, the book and title for my listeners.
Yeah, it's called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, and he talks about like there are certain hallmarks that show that there's either missing strategy or bad strategy.
Okay.
So he talks about fluff, meaning like almost like corporate jargon words, like synchronicity. Like that's our strategy. It's like that's not a strategy. That's just a piece of jargon.
Right.
An inability to like actually face the challenges. So strategy is being able to see like if we're trying to get from A to B, there are barriers to getting to B. How are we going to deal with those barriers?
Right.
And if you don't actually name them, you don't have a winning strategy.
Yeah, well, I like that.
I think the biggest one, his third one, is mistaking goals for strategy. That somehow, because we've become more KPI driven, just by slapping up some goals,
yes,
we suddenly have a strategy. Like, no, you have goals. That doesn't mean you know how to get to the goals.
That's
strategy
a good
is
point.
answering the how question.
Yep.
And then lastly, like just bad strategic objectives. What if like I'm trying to get from A to B, but B is a bad place to be?
Yeah.
Like I've actually misread the room.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's so important for nonprofits to do is to name, like, this is where we want to be. And if we want to get here, here's our if-then strategy statement of how we intend to do that. And every single thing we do, we can filter through that. All of our decision making, all the way down to every single day, I know exactly how the things that I'm doing connect to that strategy.
Yeah.
If I can't do that, I've actually got a bad strategy.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, so you feel like nonprofits maybe in general are decent with the why, but the how, the strategy part is where they really struggle.
Yeah. I mean, like the why, like, Simon Sinek, you got to start with the why. Like,
exactly.
That's why we're in this game to begin with. That's what gets us up in the morning.
That's right.
That's why we can't go to bed at night, because we're worried the why won't materialize.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we have a good plan. It just means we've got the heart for it.
Yeah. That's good. I like that distinction. I think you're absolutely right on that. That's good. Well, you've worked for, like, I've heard over 1,300 nonprofits across various sectors, and you've gained a lot of insights, I know, from this. Give us a couple of your key findings when it comes to what leads to effective leadership when it comes to nonprofit organizations.
All right. Well, just to be clear, I've not personally worked with 1,300, but the organization I does or has.
That's a lot of nonprofits right there.
Yeah. Here's what let me preface this. I'm going to make a couple of big statements.
Okay. All right.
You tell me if you think I'm wrong. And
okay.
It's perfectly fine with me. First, I think leading a nonprofit is the hardest job in the world.
I agree.
Genuinely think that it is. We were working.
Well, let me stop you. Why do you think that? What's the reason? Maybe that's what you're going to say, but yeah, why is that?
I think you have the largest number of variables that aren't controllable.
Okay.
In that position, because so much of it is like, how is the market doing? That will control, because it's built on donors for most nonprofits are. The world that most nonprofit leaders grew up in was in the business world. And the fundamentals of the business world are different as it relates to leadership. and what it looks like to lead day to day in that organization.
Yeah.
We were working with this guy who was the CFO of a global conglomerate. I mean, a $30 billion corporation.
Yeah.
And he took over a very large flagship nonprofit, and he bombed out in less than a year.
Wow.
And not because he wasn't a good leader.
Right.
It's because the fundamentals of the leadership of an organization, of a nonprofit, are different.
Yeah.
And adapting to that quickly is very difficult, even for the sharpest of leaders.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just why I think it's such a hard job. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes along why I think it's a hard job, but I think it's really difficult.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Well, look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is www.donorbox.org. Hey friends, thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Many of you know that I provide leadership and life coaching. With my 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard leaders like you work. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on and to get help with the barriers and leadership challenges you will face both professionally and personally. I really want to help people thrive and become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. And it's been so much fun working as a coach, working with clients who are leaders just like you, looking to grow personally and professionally. What you may not know is that I also provide consulting services. Currently, I'm working with an organization to help them create a clear strategy and plan to raise $3.5 million to expand their organization. So perhaps you're an executive director and you sense your organization has hit a lid on growth and you need a strategy as to how you can scale your nonprofit. Or perhaps the culture you set out to create is not the culture you have currently and it's impacting your staff retention. Or maybe you're facing a major resource challenge and you don't know what to do. That's where I can help. I come alongside leaders and organizations to create strategies to grow their organizations and maximize their impact. If your nonprofit needs help with fundraising, strategy, or operational effectiveness, reach out today. You can simply email me at rob@robharder.com. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or you can call me, 435-776-5173. I would be happy to provide a free sample coaching session or a consult to see how I can best be of help to you and your organization. Well, thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Oh, I think you're right. It's interesting. I recently had lunch with a friend who worked at the city position, and with the city, they have a pretty large tax base. And so one of the things he realized as he switched down to the nonprofit sector as an executive director was that all these departments, whether it be HR or finance or marketing, communication, tech, when he worked at the city, he was like, oh yeah, there was a department for every one of those areas. For his nonprofit, that was a little bit more on the smaller end, but they didn't have a department. It was him. He'd have to go get it and figure out, okay, I got to do this, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do this. So he didn't realize that's another thing I would say for nonprofits, that unless you start really growing and scaling, you're going to end up doing a lot of things, and you have to do them really well because people have high expectations for you because they want you, hey, I invested money in your organization, do something good with it, right? So there's high pressure, high expectation, but there's not often enough money to hire all the people you need, and therefore you end up doing way more. And so, yeah, I think it is one of the most difficult positions of leadership. And then the last piece would just be so much of what you do as a nonprofit also depends on volunteers. So people choose to be involved or not. They're not required to be there. You can't incentivize them by giving them a trip to Hawaii. They're there because hopefully you're leading well and you're providing a compelling mission, but you have to have a good strategy to achieve that mission. So anyway, I'm definitely right there with you. I think it's one of the most leadership intensive positions you can get. So any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
To go to your question, what have we learned is necessary for effective leadership? I think it starts with, I think Max Dupree talked about the first job of a leader is to define reality.
Yeah, I like that.
And I think one of the pieces of reality that some nonprofit leaders have not seen, not because they're trying to avoid it, but it's I didn't even fully see it until someone actually told this to me, is the compensation formula for staff is different.
Yeah.
And so the way that we kind of think about it is compensation equals pay plus meaning.
Okay.
And so because what we're saying in the nonprofit sector is you're going to take a 30 to 40% haircut on how much you're going to make.
Right.
And the trade-off that you're getting is more meaning.
Right.
Well, that's a really delicate balance
It really
in that
is.
formula. Because what if the fundamentals of our strategy or our plan or my job change and suddenly the meaning drops?
Right.
And I become dissatisfied with the meaning. Well, then I've got a problem on my hands as the leader of that nonprofit, because now I have someone who feels like they're being undervalued and undercompensated, even though their pay is the same.
Yep.
Because as nonprofit leaders, we didn't recognize the formula to begin with. And so I think that's one of the big ones.
That's a good way to put it. I think actually I like what you said. And the other interesting thing is I've had, again, many people on the show that work at corporations that now have a social enterprise or a philanthropic foundation or fund that's a part of or an arm of their big business. Google has it, Amazon have it. All these big corporations have this now, and they're trying to inject value, if you will, or a mission-driven aspect to their company. So you could say, well, I'll just work for them and do good, and I get compensated much better. And so you're right. I think that combination is really important to make sure you have both. But I think it is a delicate balance. I'm also a big believer that we need to pay people better in the nonprofit world. If you expect high, quality and professionalism, you need to pay for that too. And we shouldn't just expect people to just be good with a 30 or 40%. Maybe it's a 20, 25%, right? But it's not so low that meaning quotient, like you said, part of the equation is just not sufficient to get them to the point where they'll stay. Because, that's another thing. I've had multiple conversations with staff retention topics. And that is one of the biggest issues right now facing our sector, is just not the ability to keep people. And one of its compensation reasons.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit what you're just kind of drafting off of what you just said. This is one of those where you might cringe a little, but sort of the way that we talk about your average nonprofit organization is it has a kind of like bigger heart, lower competency culture.
Okay.
Because it attracts people who are like, I'll make less money. But sometimes the people who would say that also do not have the requisite skills in order to do that.
Fair point.
And so, again, I'm not trying to that's a bit of an overstatement. I kind of get that. But I think if you're listening to this podcast, there's a very good chance you know what I'm talking about, where you had a group of people who were well-meaning, but did not have all of the skills that you would like them to have to be in the role that they had.
Right.
And so that goes back to this is one of the reasons it's a really hard job, the hardest in the world.
Yep.
Is how do you take that kind of culture? Culture change is the hardest leadership skill there is.
Yeah. How
do you change that culture to keep the heart, add positive pressure to increase the skills as well and to change the culture?
No, we'll have to get another conversation for another day. But I think, yes, in the sense of, I think just to be aware of that, I think you're absolutely right. And then it kind of leads me to, I wanted to ask more about these leaders intensives that you provide, because it's, again, we're talking about leadership and particularly in the nonprofit sector. And this podcast is dedicated to leadership. And I think it's so important that people continue to grow and develop as leaders as their organization grows. Because if they want their organization to grow, they need to grow individually as leaders. Talk more about the process of helping people through their own personal leadership growth plan. You provide that with these intensives that you offer there at Catapult. I think you believe you focus on wiring, calling, and story, and then you help create a plan from there. Talk a bit about that. How does that work out, and what are some of those key pieces that you help leaders go through?
Yeah, again, if you're listening to this, we've all as leaders had those pivotal moments in the same way that organizations have a pivotal moment. The same is true of us as leaders. There are times in our life where it feels like a window of change has opened and we're not exactly sure how to navigate that. Do I stay here? Am I supposed to go somewhere else? Do we need to change? There's a restlessness that we sometimes feel, or definitely. Even just tiredness. Because leadership in this sector can feel sometimes like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And we have to know that the suffering is worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like, if you've ever read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl,
Sure. Great book.
he talks about like the ability to find meaning in suffering is how we keep going.
Right.
And so if we're going to stay in the game, leading a very difficult thing, like some of the most important things that exist,
Yeah.
I need to be able to bring my best self to that.
Right.
And so the intensive is really trying to unwind like the way that we're wired as like you uniquely, the things that like brought you into this sector, into leading in the beginning. And then like, where are you like as it relates to you, your health, your family, the things that you want to do, because we're holistic beings. We're not automatons who can beautifully like separate like work life and everything else in life. We need help untangling some of those things.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay.
this leadership's really personal.
Yeah.
And so we try to make that intensive, like it should feel freeing. It's not therapy. It is not life coaching. It's just trying to help you get clarity
Okay.
on where you should focus and like bring your best, healthiest self.
Okay. And as you do this work with leaders, how does one connecting their natural tendencies and their life experiences and personal choices together really help strengthen one's leadership and then address potential weaknesses?
Yeah. So I think there's the personal wiring perspective, but then there's like the culture that we all find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of cultural oughts and shoulds.
Mm-hmm.
So like a good leader ought to do this. A bad leader should never do this.
Right. Right.
And that can change depending on which sector you find yourself in.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that that's who you are.
Right.
And so part of it is just untangling. You heard at some point in your life when you were 19 that a leader does blank, and you've been trying to live into that since you were 19, but it's not who you are.
Right.
What would it look like to be the you size version of you as a leader?
Okay.
And not trying to fill in someone else's mold. So I think part of that is just who are you, and really unpacking that and the shaping experiences you've had in a way that allows you to be free to be the best version of your leadership self.
And these intensives, do they sign up and then it's a period of a couple of days, weeks, and then there's a follow-up? Tell us a little bit about the process of that.
Yeah, so it starts with a couple of days where we're together. It's one-on-one, and it's conversational, it's relaxed. There are some exercises, but like good meals. But it's meant to be like we're going on walks, going to museums, things like that, but like trying to stay active and engaging all of ourselves in that. Coming out of that, we're starting to develop a really simple plan for what your next season should look like of leadership, and some of like just really practical, actionable next steps. And as that develops over usually like a month or two, once that's finalized, we usually do about 6 to 9 months of quarterly check-in, just to like, how are those goals going? And just making sure that you're refreshing for what the next 90 days should look like. And just having like, starting to turn the flywheel of refreshing those 90 days so that you can live into the plan.
Yeah. Okay. I like it. Well, we talked a little bit about, again, retention, just from, since you're doing so much work with organizations and leaders, trying to make them better and stronger and healthier. What are you seeing in terms of why nonprofit organizations specifically are having such a hard time keeping their people and motivating them to stay? What have you found in your neck of the woods, so to speak?
It's a good question. I think reference the one question, the one thing I said earlier around meaning.
Yeah. Okay.
Our ability to help the people who are on our teams find meaning in what they're doing. And they've made that trade-off.
Okay.
They don't even know that that was not a conscious decision they made, but it's rumbling around inside of them.
Okay.
So I think being able to like help people see my job as the leader is to help them find meaning in what they're doing is really important. I do think they're like, as human beings, we are wired towards self-preservation.
Yeah.
And we oftentimes will make snap decisions without understanding why we're even making those decisions.
Yep.
And so I think one of the things that we found that is helpful in helping leaders create sort of like the little like jargony catchphrase that we have. We want to have culture in teams where everyone wants to work and no one wants to leave.
Yeah.
And the hallmark of those is we're actually fighting self-preservation in each of the team members.
Okay.
And we usually are doing that in regularly asking ourselves 3 questions. Number 1, what am I afraid of losing? 2, what am I trying to hide? And 3, what am I trying to prove and to whom?
Say those questions again, just for my listeners. I think they're good questions. Yeah.
Yeah. What am I afraid of losing?
Uh-huh.
What am I trying to hide? And what am I trying to prove and to whom?
Okay. Yeah. Good questions.
And so just by regularly being in conversation, either like as the leader one-on-one with someone that I'm mentoring or investing in, or creating a culture of leadership development, or even as a team, like at an executive team level, or however big your organization is, just normalizing those kinds of questions, recognizing we have hidden drivers in us that make us make snap decisions.
Yep.
And that's also, just to be clear, like that is also true in the business world. This is not a nonprofit unique thing.
Yeah.
This is sector wide.
Yeah.
So I think it's just everyone's struggling with retention right now. And there's a reason for that. That's not unique to us.
Yeah. Okay. No, very helpful insights. This has been a great conversation. So how can people find out more about you and more about Catapult?
Yeah. If you go to wearecatapult.org, you will find our website.
Hey, that's pretty easy. Okay.
Yeah, we've got, like everyone, we've got some really good articles. We've got some downloadable ebooks. One of the more popular ones are the 3 leadership skills for the future. A lot of people have downloaded that one.
Nice.
Would love to chat to anyone who wants to talk.
That's awesome. Well, I love what you're doing, investing in leaders, and then in turn, you're investing in organizations. So thanks for all you're doing for the nonprofit leaders that are out there listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You got it.
Hey friends, well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community, find other resources and interviews of past guests, all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep making your world better.
This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.